night air over the Mediterranean was thick with salt and tension. July 9, 1943. Operation Husky was about to begin, the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen, and Private James Sullivan couldn't stop his hands from shaking. Not from fear, though God knows there was plenty to be afraid of, but from the cold. The sea, 47 transport plane rattled and groaned as it cut through the darkness, carrying 82 paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment toward Sicily. They were supposed to be the tip of the spear, the advance force that would secure vital bridges and crossroads before the massive beach landings at dawn. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was going according to plan. Sullivan pressed his face against a small window, watching the searchlights sweep across the sky like fingers of an angry god. Anti-aircraft fire burst in orange blooms all around them, each explosion close enough to make the plane buck and shudder. He could hear Lieutenant Morrison shouting something from the front of the aircraft, but the words were lost in the roar of the engines and the thunder of flak. Next to him, Corporal Danny Reeves was singing. Actually singing. Some old Irish tune his grandmother had taught him, voice barely audible but steady as a rock. That was Danny, 19 years old, and somehow the calmest man in the entire regiment. The plan had been simple, at least on paper. Thousands of Allied paratroopers would drop inland, while the largest naval armada ever assembled would land 160,000 troops on the beaches. Sicily would fall in days, then Italy, then Hitler's fortress Europe would start to crumble. That was the plan. But plans, as every soldier knows, rarely survive first contact with the enemy. Or in this case, first contact with Mediterranean weather, inexperienced pilots, and the fog of war so thick you could choke on it. Morrison finally made it back to the crowded fuselage, grabbing onto whatever he could as the plane lurched again. His face was pale in the red light of the cabin. "Winds are stronger than expected," he shouted, loud enough for the men nearest to hear. "Pilots are scattered. Some planes already turned back. We're going in regardless." He didn't need to say the rest. They all knew what scattered meant. It meant they wouldn't be dropping in neat formations onto designated zones. It meant chaos. It meant they'd be alone. Sullivan checked his gear for the 100th time. Parachute strapped tight. M1 guaranteed secure. 3 grenades. 200 rounds of ammunition. A combat knife his father had carried in the First War. A photograph of a girl back in Boston folded in his breast pocket, protected by 2 layers of waterproof wrapping. Sarah. They'd only been on 4 dates before he shipped out, but he'd promised her he'd come back. Now, 30,000 feet above enemy territory with the night exploding around them, that promise felt impossibly distant. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, barely comprehensible through the static. 2 minutes to drop zone. Repeat 2 minutes. But Sullivan could see through the window that nothing below looked like the maps they'd studied. No rivers in the right places. No distinctive landmarks, just darkness and the occasional burst of tracer, fire reaching up from the ground like deadly fireflies. They were lost, completely, utterly lost, and they were about to jump anyway. Morrison hooked up first, then moved down the line, checking each man's static line with quick, efficient movements. When he reached Sullivan, their eyes met. The lieutenant was 24, barely older than most of the men he commanded. But he had something Sullivan had noticed in all the good officers, a kind of quiet certainty, even when everything was falling apart. "See you on the ground, Sullivan," Morrison said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Sullivan nodded. "What else could you do?" The red light above the door turned green. The jump master yanked the door open, and wind screamed into the cabin like a living thing. Morrison didn't hesitate. He stepped into the void and was gone. One by one, the men followed. Sullivan watched Reeves disappear, still humming that tune. Then it was his turn. He grabbed the sides of the door, felt the plane shake as another flak burst exploded somewhere behind them, and jumped. The shock of the slipstream hit him like a freight train. For 3 seconds it felt like 3 hours. He was falling free, the wind tearing at his uniform, the ground invisible below. Then the parachute deployed with a crack that jerked him upright, so hard his teeth clacked together. Suddenly, everything was quiet, relatively quiet. He could still hear the planes overhead, still see the flak, But he was floating now, drifting down through the darkness like a ghost. Around him, he could make out maybe a dozen other chutes, pale mushrooms against the black sky. Not the hundreds there should have been. Scattered, just like Morrison said. The ground came up fast. Sullivan bent his knees, tried to remember his training, and hit hard. Pain shot through his left ankle as he rolled, the parachute dragging him several feet before he managed to pop the release. He lay still for a moment, breathing hard, listening. Gunfire in the distance, shouting in Italian. The rumble of what might have been tanks or might have been thunder. He struggled to his feet, tested the ankle, twisted but not broken. Lucky, he gathered his chute, stuffed it under a nearby bush, and checked his rifle. Still intact, still loaded. Now what? The rally point was supposed to be a farmhouse 3 miles north of the drop zone. But Sullivan had no idea where the drop zone was anymore, let alone which way was north. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The stars were no help. He pulled out his compass, squinted at it in the darkness. East. The gunfire was coming from the east. That meant west was probably safer. Probably. He started moving, keeping low, try to make as little noise as possible in the unfamiliar terrain. He found Reeves 10 minutes later, or rather Reeves found him. A low whistle from behind a stone wall nearly made Sullivan shoot his best friend. "Jesus," Danny hissed. "Announce yourself." Reeves grinned, that same easy grin he'd had since basic training. "Where's the fun in that? You see anyone else?" Sullivan shook his head. They waited together by the wall, hoping more men would appear, knowing they probably wouldn't. After 20 minutes, they had to make a decision. Stay put or move. The lieutenant said if we got separated, head for high ground. Reeves said. Sullivan looked around. Everything looked flat to him, but then Danny pointed west. "There, that ridge. Maybe we can see something from up there." It was as good a plan as any. They moved out, 2 men alone in enemy territory with no idea where they were or where they were going. Just 2 more pieces of the invasion that had already shattered before it began. They found 4 more paratroopers at the ridge. Young kid from Texas named Cooper, an older sergeant named Halloran, who'd somehow managed to land in a tree and climb down without breaking his neck, and 2 privates from another company who'd gotten separated from their entire stick. 7 men, 7 out of 82 from their plane alone. Halloran took charge immediately. That was his nature. He spread them out along the ridge, established a perimeter, and sent Cooper up a tree to act as lookout. From their position, they could see lights in the distance. A town, maybe, or military installation. Impossible to tell. "We need to link up with friendly forces," Halloran said, studying his map by the light of a carefully shielded flashlight. "Problem is, I have no idea where friendly forces are. We could be 5 miles from the beach or 50. One of the other privates, a pale kid named Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant, spoke up. "I heard the planes were blown off course. Pilots were inexperienced, couldn't handle the winds. We could be anywhere in Sicily." Halloran folded the map. "Then we make ourselves useful where we are. Standard recon protocol. We observe, we gather intelligence, and we stay alive until we can rejoin the main force." They spent the rest of the night in that position, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten from black to gray to the pale blue of pre-dawn. Sullivan took the second watch, lying on his stomach at the edge of the ridge, scanning the landscape below through field glasses. What he saw made his blood run cold. Tanks, at least a dozen of them, possibly more, dug into defensive positions along what looked like a major road. German tanks, the distinctive angular shapes of Panzer IVs. And not just tanks. Infantry, artillery pieces. This wasn't some minor outpost. This was a fortified defensive line. When Halloran saw what Sullivan was looking at, he let out a low whistle. "That's the road to Gela," he said quietly. "Has to be, which means the beach landings are going to come up against that." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, we need to get word to someone. If those tanks hit our boys while they're landing, it'll be a massacre. But who could they tell? They had no radio, no way to communicate with anyone. They were cut off, isolated, exactly what they'd been trained to avoid. That's when they heard it. The drone of aircraft engines, different from the night before. Heavier, more purposeful. Then, on the horizon to the south, they saw them. Ships, hundreds of ships, spread across the Mediterranean like a gray carpet. The invasion fleet. Dawn was breaking, and Operation Husky was beginning in earnest, with or without the scattered paratroopers, with or without the element of surprise they were supposed to provide. Sullivan watched landing craft detach from the larger ships, tiny from this distance, heading toward beaches he couldn't see from his position. Men were dying down there, right now, and these 7 soldiers on a ridge were helpless to do anything about it, except they weren't helpless. Not entirely. Halloran gathered them together, his face set in hard lines. Those tanks are going to move out soon as they get orders. When they do, they're heading straight for our boys on the beaches. We can't stop them. 7 men against a Panzer company? That's suicide. But maybe we can slow them down. Buy some time for the landing force to establish a foothold. Cooper, the kid from Texas, looked skeptical. How exactly do we slow down a dozen tanks, Sarge? Halloran smiled, but there was no humor in it. We get creative. The plan, such as it was, relied on chaos and audacity in equal measure. The German position was strong, but it was also static, designed to defend against an attack from the south. They weren't expecting trouble from behind. Halloran's idea was simple. They'd infiltrate close to the German lines, create as much noise and confusion as possible, make the Germans think they were under attack from a much larger force. The tanks would be forced to either turn and defend or withdraw to a more secure position. Either way, they'd be delayed. Even 30 minutes could make the difference between a successful landing and a disaster. They moved out at full dawn, using what cover they could find, working their way down from the ridge toward the German position. Sullivan's ankle throbbed with every step, but he pushed the pain aside. Focus on the mission. Focus on staying alive. They got within 200 yards before they hit their first problem. A German patrol, for men, walking directly toward them. There was no time to hide, no time to avoid contact. Halloran made a decision in an instant. Hand signals. Take them quietly. What followed was brutal and brief. Sullivan had trained for hand-to-hand combat, but training and reality were completely different things. The German soldier he grappled with was older, experienced, and strong. They struggled in silence, rolling in the dirt, each trying to get a killing grip on the other. Sullivan finally managed to get his knife free and drove it upward, felt it punch through fabric and flesh. The German's eyes went wide with shock, then empty. Sullivan rolled off him, gasping, his hands shaking again, not from cold this time. Reeves was next to him, hand on his shoulder. "You good?" Sullivan nodded, not trusting his voice. Around them, the others were checking the other German bodies. All 4 were dead. Halloran was already moving on, stripping one of the Germans of his ammunition and a stick grenade. Equipment check. Take what you need. We got maybe 5 minutes before someone realizes this patrol is missing. They made it to within 100 yards of the tank position before the alarm went up. Someone must have found the patrol, or maybe they'd been spotted by a sentry they hadn't seen. Either way, suddenly the German position erupted in activity. Men running to defensive positions, officers shouting orders, engines starting to roar as the tanks prepared to move. Halloran didn't wait. "Now, everything you've got." He raised his rifle and fired into the confusion below. 7 rifles opened up simultaneously. It wasn't enough firepower to do real damage, but that wasn't the point. The point was to create confusion, to make them think they were under attack from a significant force. Sullivan fired and fired, working the bolt action of his rifle, ejecting brass, loading new rounds. Beside him, Reeves was using the German stick grenade, hurling it as far as he could toward the nearest tank. It exploded with a sharp crack, probably not damaging the tank, but definitely getting everyone's attention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun fire raked their position, forcing them to dive for cover behind a low stone wall. Mortar rounds began falling, walking closer with each explosion. A Panzer's main gun swung toward them, the barrel enormous from this distance. Fall back. Halloran screamed. Leapfrog pattern. Move. They retreated in the classic pattern, half the team firing while the other half moved, then switching. It was desperate and chaotic, but it was working. They were moving away from the German position. And more importantly, the Germans weren't moving toward the beaches. Not yet. They made it back to the ridge. Somehow, all 7 of them still alive, though Cooper had taken a bullet through his left arm, and one of the other privates, whose name Sullivan still hadn't learned, had shrapnel in his leg. They collapsed behind cover, breathing hard, checking ammunition. Sullivan had 3 rounds left. Reeves had 5. The others weren't much better off. That won't work twice, the wounded private said, grimacing as Halloran tied a bandage around his leg. The sergeant nodded grimly. Didn't expect it to, but look. He pointed down at the German position. The tanks were moving, but not south toward the beaches. They were repositioning, forming a defensive perimeter, clearly spooked by the unexpected attack. Officers were scrambling around, probably trying to figure out if this was a small harassment action or the vanguard of a larger Allied force. It wouldn't take them long to figure out the truth, but every minute of confusion was a minute the beach landings had to succeed. Halloran checked his watch. We bought them maybe 20 minutes. 30 if we're lucky. It'll have to be enough. But it wasn't over. As they watched, a German patrol started up the ridge toward them. Not a small patrol this time. 20 men, maybe more, with an officer leading them. They were coming to finish what the 7 paratroopers had started. Halloran looked at his men. Exhausted, low on ammunition. 2 wounded. Ideas, he asked. Nobody had any good ones. They could run, try to lose patrol in the rough terrain beyond the ridge. But that would just delay the inevitable. They could try to fight, but 7 men against 20 with almost no ammunition? That was suicide. That's when Sullivan remembered the parachutes. His, stuffed under a bush near his landing site. The others, probably scattered across a mile of Sicilian countryside. Silk parachutes, dozens of them, each one marked with clear Allied insignia. An idea started forming, crazy and desperate, but maybe, just maybe possible. He turned to Halloran. Sarge, what if we make them think the whole division landed here? What if they think we're not 7 guys, but the advanced element of hundreds? Halloran looked at him like he was insane. And how exactly do we do that? Sullivan explained quickly. The parachutes. If they could gather even a dozen of them, spread them out across the hillside where the Germans would see them, it would look like a major drop zone. Combined with the attack they just launched, it might convince the Germans that a significant Allied force was operating behind their lines. They'd have to commit serious resources to deal with the threat, resources that wouldn't be attacking the beaches. It was thin, but it was something. Halloran thought for maybe 5 seconds. Do it. Cooper and Morrison, you're with Sullivan. The rest of us will slow down that patrol. Go. They ran. Sullivan's ankles screamed in protest, but he ignored it. They had maybe 10 minutes before the German patrol reached their position. They needed to find parachutes and deploy them in a way that looked convincing. Reeves spotted the first one, draped over an olive tree like a ghost. They pulled it down, dragged it 50 yards, and spread it out in clear view of the valley below. Then the next one, and the next. They worked frantically, racing against time and the approaching Germans. By the time the German patrol reached the ridge, 9 parachutes were visible, white and obvious against the brown Sicilian hillside. Sullivan and the others had rejoined Halloran's group just as the Germans crested the ridge. The sergeant had positioned his men perfectly, using the terrain to make their small force seem larger. When the German officer saw the parachutes, saw the defensive positions, he held up his hand. The patrol stopped. Sullivan could see the officer scanning the hillside, counting parachutes, making calculations, more shouting in German. Then, incredibly, the patrol started to withdraw. They watched in amazement as the Germans retreated back down the ridge, moving faster now, clearly reporting back to their command. Halloran let out a breath he'd been holding. They bought it. They actually bought it. From their position, they could see renewed activity at the tank position, more defensive preparations, vehicles moving away from the coastal road. They were digging in, preparing for an attack that wasn't coming. An attack they thought was coming from a full airborne division, not 7 desperate men with a handful of silk parachutes. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the Sicilian day hot and brutal. They could hear the battle raging to the south, the constant rumble of naval guns, the crack of artillery, the occasional rattle of small arms fire. The invasion was ongoing, and they had no way of knowing if it was succeeding or failing. Cooper's arm was getting worse, infection probably setting in. The other wounded private was running a fever. They needed to link up with friendly forces soon, or they'd lose men to wounds that should have been survivable. It was mid-afternoon when they saw the American patrol, a full platoon moving cautiously up from the south, weapons ready. Halloran made sure they could see his helmet, his uniform, then called out the proper challenge code. The response came back immediately. They were friendly. They were saved. The lieutenant leading the platoon was young. Couldn't have been more than 22, but he looked at the 7 paratroopers with something like awe. "You guys are from the 505th? We've been looking for you. Command thought your whole stick was lost." Halloran gave him a brief rundown of what they'd done: the harassment attack, the parachute deception, the German defensive response. The lieutenant's eyes got wider as the story went on. "You guys tied up an entire panzer company with 7 men and some parachutes?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Do you know what that means? 3rd Infantry Division landed on those beaches this morning. If those tanks had hit them during the landing, we'd have had a disaster. Instead, the beaches are secured. We're pushing inland, and you 7 idiots are probably the reason why." They made it back to Allied lines that evening, exhausted, filthy, half-starved, but alive. All 7 of them. The field hospital took Cooper and the other wounded man immediately. The rest were given hot food, clean water, and a place to sleep that wasn't the ground. Sullivan collapsed onto a cot and was asleep in seconds. He dreamed of falling, but in the dream, his parachute didn't open. He fell and never hit the ground. He woke to Morrison shaking his shoulder. His lieutenant, alive and looking surprisingly intact for someone who jumped into the middle of a combat zone. "Sullivan, you awake?" Sullivan nodded groggily. Morrison sat on the edge of the cot. "I heard what you did. Halloran told me everything. The attack on the tanks. The parachute trick. That was good thinking." He paused. "I'm putting you and Reeves in for commendations. All of you, what you did saved lives. Probably hundreds of lives." Sullivan didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded. The invasion of Sicily took 38 days. Operation Husky, despite its chaotic start, was ultimately successful. The Allies secured the island, proved they could launch massive amphibious operations, and opened the door to the invasion of Italy. But the airborne assault, the part that was supposed to be the tip of the spear, was a mess. Planes scattered across 200 miles of Sicily, paratroopers landing in the wrong places, sometimes in the Mediterranean itself. Of the 3,400 American paratroopers who jumped that night, nearly half were scattered far from their drop zones. Many were captured, many were killed, but many, like Sullivan and his small group, found ways to contribute despite the chaos. The official after-action reports were brutal in their assessment: poor planning, inadequate pilot training, failure to account for weather conditions. The whole operation was labeled a disaster by some analysts. But Sullivan knew something those analysts didn't. Sometimes disasters create opportunities. Sometimes when everything falls apart, you find out what people are really made of. 7 men with a crazy plan and some silk parachutes had delayed a panzer company long enough for a beach landing to succeed. That wasn't in any plan. That wasn't something you could prepare for. That was just soldiers doing what soldiers do, finding a way to complete the mission, even when the mission had already failed. 3 weeks later, Sullivan found himself in a field near Palermo, waiting for transport back to North Africa, and then on to the next operation. Reeves sat next to him, cleaning his rifle for the 100th time. "You think they'll fix the problems before the next jump?" Danny asked. Sullivan shrugged. "Probably not. They never do. Something will go wrong. It always does." Reeves nodded, accepting this wisdom. "But we'll figure out." It wasn't a question. Sullivan smiled. Yeah, we'll figure it out. The photograph of Sarah had survived, still tucked in his breast pocket, still protected by its waterproof wrapping. He'd written her a letter, couldn't tell her where he'd been or what he'd done, just that he was safe and thinking of her. He'd promised to come back. He intended to keep that promise. But he knew now, in a way he hadn't before, that promises made in wartime were fragile things. You kept them if you could, if you were lucky, if you were smart, if you had guys like Reeves and Halloran watching your back. The torn canvas of that parachute, the one he'd hidden under a bush and later used to deceive an entire German company, became a kind of legend in the regiment. Sullivan kept a piece of it, a small square of silk that he carried through the rest of the war. Italy, France, Germany itself. He survived all of it, though not unchanged. Nobody survives a war unchanged. But whenever things seemed impossible, whenever a plan fell apart and everything was chaos, he'd touch that piece of silk and remember. Remember that sometimes the best plans are the ones you make up on the spot. Remember that 7 men can change the course of a battle. Remember that even when you're lost and scattered and everything has gone wrong, you can still find a way to win. Years later, long after the war ended, Sullivan would tell the story to his grandchildren, how he jumped into Sicily on a night when everything went wrong, how he and 6 other men used parachutes and audacity to trick the German army, how sometimes the most important victories come from the moments when your original plan collapses and you have to improvise. The kids always loved that story. They'd ask him to tell it again and again, especially the part about the parachute spread across the hillside like ghosts. And he would tell it every time, never getting tired of it, because it was true, every improbable word of it. Sicily, 1943, when the original plan collapsed and a torn canvas let 80 men escape. Or rather, let 7 men save 80. Or maybe save 100. The numbers got bigger every year, but the truth at the heart of it never changed. When everything falls apart, you don't give up. You adapt. You improvise. You find a way. That's what soldiers do. That's what survivors do. That's what heroes do, though Sullivan never thought of himself as a hero, just a man who jumped into the darkness and found a way to land on his feet, even when the ground wasn't where it was supposed to be.